Think ancient Rome was all glory and marble? Wait until you see what really went on behind those stone walls. In ancient Rome, using the toilet wasn't a private matter, it was a public event. Literally, large communal latrines lined with stone benches had holes cut into them, and people sat side by side, chatting while doing their business. There were no dividers, no stalls, and certainly no flushing mechanism. Just open holes above a flowing water channel, usually carrying away waste to the nearest sewer, or sometimes just to the street. And the cleaning method? That's where it gets even more uncomfortable. Instead of toilet paper, Romans used a communal sponge on a stick, known as a tersorium. Everyone dipped the same sponge into a water channel, wiped, rinsed, and placed it back for the next person. No sanitizers, no soap, just water and hope. Archaeologists believe these sponges were likely soaked in vinegar or salt water to keep them clean, but let's be honest. By today's standards, that's far from reassuring. The strange part? This wasn't just for the poor. Even wealthy citizens sometimes used public latrines when out and about. Some of these facilities were even decorated with mosaics and artwork to lighten the mood, because apparently, sitting inches from someone else wasn't awkward enough. And it wasn't just the conditions that made these places unsettling. Romans believed in bathroom spirits. Yes, you heard that right. They left little offerings or carvings in latrines to appease potential demons or ghosts lurking in the drains. Some even scratched protective symbols into the stone to keep themselves safe from whatever they thought was watching from below. So the next time you're annoyed by a dirty gas station restroom, just know, it could be worse. In Rome, you'd be shoulder to shoulder with strangers, sharing a sponge and hoping nothing grabbed you from beneath. When most people think of gladiators, they picture powerful warriors like in Gladiator or Spartacus. But the truth behind the armor is far darker. Most gladiators weren't heroes. They were enslaved people, prisoners of war, or criminals forced into deadly combat for the entertainment of others. And they didn't have a choice. Trained in special schools under brutal conditions, these fighters were treated more like property than people. Some were lucky enough to gain fans and sponsorships, which could offer slightly better food or gear. But the goal remained the same: to survive long enough to keep the crowd cheering. The Colosseum wasn't just a stadium, it was a blood-soaked theater. Spectators showed up in the tens of thousands. Senators, merchants, and ordinary citizens would pack the stands, waving thumbs to decide if a man lived or died. Sometimes the contests were to the death, sometimes they were rigged, and sometimes exotic animals were released just to add chaos. Lions, leopards, and even elephants were pitted against humans, often with little chance of survival. What's even more shocking is that some Romans considered these games educational. They believed watching people face death built character and reminded them of Roman strength. It wasn't just entertainment, it was ideology. A few rare gladiators earned enough fame to buy their freedom, but most never saw it. Their names were forgotten, but their suffering helped shape one of the empire's most iconic spectacles. And while the armor looks impressive in movies, the reality underneath was chains, fear, and a fight for survival that wasn't nearly as glorious. The Romans were ahead of their time in many ways, but in one tragic twist, their clever plumbing may have helped poison an entire civilization. Their water system was advanced for the era, with aqueducts carrying fresh water into cities and homes. The problem: much of that water flowed through pipes made of lead. Lead, of course, is highly toxic, but Romans didn't know that. They used lead not just for pipes, but in cooking pots, cosmetics, paints, and even as a sweetener in food and wine. When their wine turned sour, they didn't toss it. They added a special syrup called sapa, boiled down in lead pots. The result was a sweeter, smoother drink, and a silent dose of heavy metal. Scientists today believe lead exposure was widespread in the empire, especially among the wealthy. Studies of Roman skeletons show elevated lead levels in bones. Some researchers even suggest that chronic exposure might have affected behavior and decision-making in the ruling class. Ever wonder why some emperors acted so irrationally? This might have been one of the hidden reasons. Of course, not everything in Rome contained lead, and not everyone was affected equally. But the sheer amount used in everyday life makes it clear. What the Romans thought was innovation turned out to be dangerous. Their impressive infrastructure may have looked clean and modern, but behind the marble and fountains, toxic metal flowed quietly through their veins. You've probably heard that the Romans enjoyed banquets. But what they served at those feasts, that's a different story. Roman cuisine, especially for the elite, was all about indulgence. And honestly, the stranger, the better. The weirder the dish, the more luxurious it was considered. They ate dormice, not mice that wandered into their kitchens. These were farmed specifically for eating. Fat, plump, and roasted with honey and poppy seeds, they were a prized delicacy. Flamingo tongues, peacock brains, jellyfish, and sow's wombs were also on the menu for the high and mighty. The Romans didn't waste much either. They loved dishes made from blood, organs, and animal leftovers. One favorite ingredient was garum, a fermented fish sauce made from the guts of anchovies and mackerel left to rot in the sun. It was poured over nearly everything, from meat to desserts. Think of it as the ketchup of Rome, if ketchup smelled like a mix of vinegar and dead fish. And it wasn't just about flavor. The dining experience was often theatrical. At elite banquets, animals might be brought out alive and butchered in front of guests, or dishes would be presented in strange shapes, like pies with live birds inside. It was dinner and a show often designed to shock or impress. For poorer Romans, food was simpler: grains, bread, beans. But for the elite, the goal was to show off wealth by going to culinary extremes. While modern fine dining might include truffle foam or edible gold, ancient Roman food pushed limits in ways that would make even a daring foodie hesitate. Roman culture wasn't shy about its myths, and yeah, many of those stories went far beyond what modern audiences would call PG. One of the most striking examples lies in their statues, mosaics, and pottery, where humans and animals were sometimes shown in shockingly close encounters. It wasn't just symbolism. These images reflected deeper ideas from their mythology and rituals. Take the myth of Leda and the swan. The story tells of Jupiter, the Roman version of Zeus, taking the form of a swan to seduce or overpower a woman. Versions of this tale were painted, carved, and told in Roman homes for centuries. Another well-known story involved Europa and a bull, again, Jupiter in disguise. These weren't hidden in temples or restricted to scholars. They were out in the open, part of everyday visual culture. To Roman eyes, these scenes weren't necessarily obscene. They were divine stories, tangled with ideas of power, transformation, and desire. But modern viewers can't help but raise an eyebrow. Some surviving artworks go even further, showing creatures part human and part animal in intimate situations that suggest these myths weren't just metaphor. They shaped the Romans' understanding of identity and sensuality. What's more, these images weren't tucked away in adult-only areas. They were found on household items, murals, and even in public bathhouses. Their world didn't draw the same lines of acceptable as ours. To them, the line between man, beast, and God was far more flexible, and their art shows it in vivid, unapologetic detail. In Rome, not everyone got a start in life. While families celebrated the birth of children, there was a chilling rule woven into the social fabric. A newborn's life didn't truly begin until the father accepted it. If he chose not to, the child could be exposed, a polite term for abandoning them outside the city or near a trash heap. Financial hardship, lack of space, illness, or simply being born at the wrong time. And though it sounds horrifying today, this was a socially accepted practice in ancient Rome. It wasn't done in secrecy. It was part of the norm. Some temples and shrines even had specific places where infants could be left. Occasionally, these children were taken in by others, sometimes raised as servants or, if fortunate, adopted. But many weren't that lucky. Roman law didn't consider this a crime, and philosophers of the time openly discussed when and why it was acceptable. It's a part of Roman life that rarely gets shown in movies or TV series, but it shaped the way families functioned and how society operated. The empire valued strength, order, and utility, traits that didn't always leave room for vulnerability or unpredictability. Even in matters of life, pragmatism often won over emotion. In the Roman world, violence wasn't hidden, it was center stage. What many civilizations would consider punishment or cruelty, Rome turned into spectacle. Public executions, brutal beatings, and staged deaths weren't just justice. They were events people lined up to watch. The Colosseum is the most famous arena, but it wasn't alone. Amphitheaters across the empire held deadly games. Some featured professional fighters, but others used condemned criminals in much more gruesome roles. These people weren't there to compete. They were brought out to be executed in creative, dramatic ways. Sometimes it was by wild animals, other times by staged mythical scenes where they played the victim. One reenactment might involve a man dressed as a mythological figure who was then torn apart by trained animals, as a way to retell ancient stories through live death. It was a mixture of theater and horror show, but to the Roman audience, it was both thrilling and socially acceptable. Even in smaller venues, torture was a part of public life. For those lower in the social order, especially enslaved people, confession under pressure wasn't just common, it was expected. Roman law even required that certain testimonies be extracted through physical force to be considered valid. It's easy to forget that this was a society that saw pain differently. They viewed endurance as a mark of honor and suffering, as a way to maintain control. It wasn't about hiding violence. In many cases, they elevated it to art. Step into the villas of ancient Rome and you'll find walls covered with images that would shock even modern artists. The Romans didn't just decorate with landscapes or portraits, they told wild, sometimes unbelievable stories through their art. Some of these stories involved gods taking strange forms. Others depicted beings that, to today's eyes, look almost extraterrestrial. Frescoes in places like Pompeii show divine figures with exaggerated features, elongated heads, massive eyes, unusual skin colors. Some researchers believe these were symbolic, representing otherworldly beings, but others point out how eerily they resemble modern descriptions of aliens. Whether intentional or not, the resemblance is hard to ignore, and it didn't stop at appearance. These mysterious beings were often shown in deeply intimate situations with mortals. To the Romans, these acts weren't taboo, they were sacred. Myths about Jupiter seducing mortals in strange disguises were central to Roman religion and identity. The more bizarre the union, the more powerful the offspring, or so the belief went. Art from the period didn't hold back. It was bold, surreal, and filled with scenes that blurred the lines between human, divine, and something in between. One fresco might show a human figure being embraced by a god with a glowing head. Another might depict an otherworldly being offering gifts or even knowledge to mortals. While modern viewers might see fantasy or even science fiction, for Romans these images were serious mythology. Sometimes personal, sometimes public. Their art wasn't censored and their stories didn't follow modern rules. The result is a vivid, almost psychedelic window into how they saw their universe, full of mystery, lust, power, and figures that wouldn't be out of place in a sci-fi film. Forget daggers in the back if you wanted someone out of the way in ancient Rome. You served them dinner. Poisoning wasn't just a sneaky tactic. It was practically a political tool. In the Senate, in the palace, even at elite banquets, alliances shifted based on what was in the wine glass. Some of Rome's most powerful figures met their end not on the battlefield, but at the dining table. Empresses, senators, and servants all had access to substances that could slip into a drink without a trace. Some were plant-based, others were mineral or animal-derived. A few were said to mimic illness so closely that no one would suspect foul play. There were even rumors of poison schools' private tutors who taught how to extract venom from rare plants or mix powders that worked slowly over time. Servants could be bribed to add just a touch of something extra to a cup of wine. And if you didn't die outright, you might fall ill long enough to miss a crucial vote, opening the door for someone else to rise. Even Rome's legal system wrestled with the issue. Poisonings were often hard to prove, and accusations flew wildly, especially during power transitions. Some emperors lived in constant paranoia, hiring food tasters or switching meals at the last second to avoid betrayal from within their own households. This silent method of elimination became a dark trademark of Roman politics. Trust was rare, ambition was everywhere, and the most dangerous weapon in the empire might not have been a sword. It was the second sip of wine. Not all Roman emperors were tyrants, but when they went off the rails, they took the whole empire with them. Some ruled with charisma and reform. Others, they turned the palace into a stage for their delusions, and the citizens paid the price. Caligula is one of the most infamous. He declared himself a living god, made his horse a high-ranking official, and held lavish feasts where guests were never quite sure if they were eating or about to be eaten. One day, he'd reward someone with gold. The next, he'd sentence them for sneezing too loudly. Then there was Nero, who fancied himself an artist more than a ruler. He forced senators to attend his musical performances, sometimes for hours. When a great fire tore through Rome, many claimed Nero watched it burn from his tower, playing his instrument and singing about destruction. He later blamed the tragedy on a minority group and launched brutal crackdowns to deflect blame. Commodus took things even further. Obsessed with gladiators, he fought in the arena himself, carefully staged, of course, so he'd always win. But his violent fantasies bled into his rule. He renamed months after himself, demanded to be worshipped like Hercules, and executed advisors for questioning his new titles. These weren't harmless quirks. Under their reigns, the empire teetered, Resources were wasted, public trust collapsed, and fear became the only currency in court. Rome's system, built on order and discipline, became a playground for madness, and the further an emperor drifted from reality, the more dangerous daily life became for everyone else. In ancient Rome, slavery wasn't hidden, it was embedded in everything. From the grand marble villas to the bustling markets, enslaved people were the engine that kept the empire running. They weren't just farm workers or house servants. They were accountants, teachers, cooks, construction workers, and entertainers, many of whom had no rights and no hope of freedom. Unlike in modern times where slavery is universally condemned, in Rome it was viewed as completely normal. A wealthy Roman might own dozens or even hundreds of enslaved people. Even average citizens often had at least one. They were bought, sold, punished, and inherited like property, not treated as people. Some were captured in war, others were born into servitude, and a few ended up enslaved due to debt or legal trouble. Treatment varied widely. Some were given a decent life with the chance of eventual freedom. Others lived under constant surveillance, violence, or worse. There were no laws protecting them from mistreatment, and a master could discipline them, however they liked sometimes, as a warning to others. Despite their condition, enslaved people kept the empire functioning. They built roads and aqueducts, staffed the imperial palaces, and even served in the private households of senators. Ironically, some were more educated than their owners, especially those brought in from other advanced regions of the Mediterranean. And although a handful could earn or be granted freedom, the system itself was a trap. Even freed individuals often remained in the shadow of their former masters, tied by law and reputation. Slavery wasn't the exception in ancient Rome, it was the rule. It shaped the economy, the culture, and the daily rhythm of Roman life in ways that are impossible to overlook. Ask someone what they picture when they hear ancient Rome, and chances are public baths come up. Giant marble rooms with heated pools, columns, and steam? Yes. But what doesn't get mentioned is the fact that these places were also giant reservoirs of grime, bacteria, and questionable behavior. Romans visited the baths daily. It wasn't just about getting clean, it was a social ritual. People exercised in the palaestra, got oiled down, and scraped their sweat off with a curved tool called a strigil. Then they soaked in a series of pools ranging from cold to hot, often without actually washing with soap first. Whatever they scraped off, oil, dirt, dead skin, often ended up in the water. There was no chlorine, no filtration system. The water was occasionally changed, but with hundreds of bodies going through every day, you can guess what those pools were really like. And since the floors were wet and slippery, accidents were common. Add in poor lighting and echoing acoustics, and you've got a recipe for chaos. The baths weren't just steamy hangouts. They were hotspots for gossip, pickpockets, and sometimes more adult encounters tucked into side rooms. While philosophers praised the baths as places for relaxation and community, satirists often mocked them as loud, dirty, and full of pretentious conversations. Despite all this, Romans loved them. Admission was cheap, even free on holidays. And for many, it was the only chance to access warm water and some kind of hygiene. Just don't think of them as ancient spas. They were more like a mix of a gym, public pool, and marketplace with a whole lot of body odor thrown in. In ancient Rome, crime didn't always lead to prison, but that didn't mean offenders got off easy. Punishments were often immediate, brutal, and meant to send a clear message: step out of line, and you pay, sometimes with your flesh. The justice system was sharply divided. A Roman citizen accused of theft might get a fine or public humiliation. But if you were enslaved, poor, or foreign, the consequences could be much harsher. Flogging, branding, forced labor, or exile were common. For serious theft or repeated offenses, the penalties ramped up fast, sometimes involving mutilation or forced fights in the arena. Even minor things like disrespecting a local official or cheating in the marketplace could land someone in hot water. And since trials weren't always fair, it often came down to who you knew or how much influence you had. A powerful person's word could outweigh hard evidence. Public punishment was often designed for spectacle. Stocks and whippings were carried out in forums or markets, where crowds could watch and talk. The goal wasn't just to punish the individual, it was to make sure everyone else got the message. Some emperors and governors became infamous for using over-the-top penalties to control unrest. There were cases of entire groups being punished for one person's mistake, and laws that seemed designed more to intimidate than to keep order. Roman law laid the groundwork for many legal systems today, but their methods were far from gentle. In a world built on strict hierarchy and public obedience, justice wasn't always blind. It was often ruthless. In Rome, personal freedom wasn't a guarantee. It was a privilege that could vanish overnight. The empire was built on control, and if you weren't part of the ruling elite, your life could be redirected, restricted, or ended with a single order. Loyalty mattered, but usefulness mattered more. Citizenship provided some protection, but even then, the state could conscript you into the army, confiscate your property, or exile you without warning if you angered the wrong person. Trials were public, fast, and often biased. The higher your status, the better your chances. For everyone else, it was survival by obedience. If you were enslaved, the state didn't see you as a person. You had no legal identity. If your owner died or was punished, you might be sold, split from your family, or simply forgotten. Even freed individuals, liberty, lived under the shadow of their former masters and had limited rights. Roman infrastructure was impressive, but it served the state first. Roads were built to move legions. Cities were designed for surveillance and order. Entertainment, like the games, wasn't just for fun. It was used to distract and control the public. Even religion was tied to political power. The emperor wasn't just a ruler, he was seen as a living link to the gods. The message was clear: you were part of the machine. And if that machine needed to replace you, it wouldn't blink. There were always more workers, more soldiers, more citizens. Life in Rome had its rewards, but safety wasn't one of them unless you were at the top. That's about it. Would you like to travel to ancient Rome by time machine after all you've heard? Write in the comments, and don't forget to check out our other videos.